We come to Berlin, we American presidents, because it's our duty to speak in this place of freedom. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast, a place of learning for those who aspire to leadership excellence. Here's our host, Mike Etor.
Doug Thorpe has over 30 years of leadership experience spanning military service as a U.S. Army officer, serving in Fortune 500 corporate leadership roles, and as a serial entrepreneur who has founded 5 companies. Doug brings a unique perspective to modern leadership challenges, and he is the go-to expert for overwhelmed leaders who want to stop burning out while building high-performing teams. He is an author and is the host of a podcast called Leadership Powered by Common Sense. He's a sought-after international speaker, and he's also the author of one book called Stop Leading on Empty, a common sense guide to leading without burning out. We'll maybe talk about that today, Doug. Doug's based in Houston, Texas. He continues to coach executives and consult with organizations worldwide. And Doug, I've been stalking you on social media, and I can't thank you enough for being here and sharing your wisdom with the audience. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Mike. A pleasure to be here. And as I told you in the green room, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think you and I are going to be brothers and another mother here before we know it.
Oh, cool. Well, the intro was brief. Do we need to know anything more? What more do we need to know about Doug personally and professionally?
Well, I think the one thing I'll add that is an interesting twist, and I know we've got it on the agenda to get into this a little bit later, but I think one of the differentiating things that I find valuable is that I was raised the only child of a single mom who herself happened to be an entrepreneur. That's why that kind of got in my blood. And even though at the time I was experiencing it with her, I was too young to know exactly what that meant. But I watched her build her business and do things. But in parallel with all that, she had the wisdom to surround me with mentors. She had made a vow to never remarry, but she knew a young boy needed some male influence. So she recruited mentors for me. And at a young age, I had a number of individuals simultaneously available to take me out on a fishing trip or camping trip or learn how to play golf or learn how to do woodworking. And it was things that became developmental elements for me. And it was a practice that I just really valued, and it became second nature. And when I went off to college, I was not afraid to walk up to a near stranger and say, "You look like somebody that knows something I ought to know. Would you mind spending some time with me? Can I hang out and can we talk about things?" It's just been a practice I've adopted all my life, and I encourage all of my clients to consider that if they haven't already done some form of it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, who does your company? Are you a solo entrepreneur now with this coaching? You work with other partners, and who are your clients? How do you help them?
I have, technically on paper, I am a solopreneur. I have a coaching firm that is formally named Headway Exec. However, I've built a portfolio of affiliate relationships that I've got with some of the bigger brand name practices on the globe. I am an adjunct coach with Franklin Covey. I'm with the Lee Hecht Harrison Adecco group, more specifically their platform called Ezra, which is a pretty widely adopted. Ezra now globally performs over 200,000 coaching sessions a month.
Wow.
So it's a pretty big network of global coaches, all ICF certified, and it's a great group of people to be in. But then in addition to all of that, I do have, believe it or not, I still have a private practice that I spend most of my time there in the entrepreneurial space working with mid-sized company business owners.
Cool. Well, Doug, if I ran into you 2 months ago, I recognized you were in an elevator together. I know I ain't got much time. I'll say, "Hey, Doug, I'm a fan." ain't got much time. What's your elevator version of your leadership philosophy? What would you tell me?
Leadership philosophy. I was an adopter and user of servant leadership before it was a thing. I just felt a gravitational pull in that direction. I just had this burning sense of finding ways and opportunities to serve others. And typically that started with a project team or an organization that was serving some population or group. But then as I matured in my own understanding, I realized that leading that group to do the things for the audience they were programmed to support was just as important. So it really is embodied in that servant leadership idea.
I love servant leadership, and as you know, it was that term, I believe, was coined by a guy named Robert Greenleaf in 1949.
Correct.
That said, to prove that, there's nothing new under the sun, in the Marine Corps, which I was a career Marine, we have a very famous general in our history called General John Lejeune. And he wrote a famous document about the relationship between enlisted and officer that is still read annually on the Marine Corps birthday. And if you read that document, Doug, and you didn't know how old it was, you would say, this is servant leadership. You know what I mean? It's to a T. He's describing it. And I find that, most of the very best leaders I've been exposed to, whether they realize it, consciously or not, they're checking most of the boxes on what you and I would know as servant leadership,
Correct.
Which, as you know, is a lot common sense and really focusing on the lead. They're the most important in the leader to lead equation. Focus on them, make them successful. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And I've often reflected on some of my own experiences growing up. I had an interesting opportunity when the college years rolled around. I was telling you in the green room, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. And at that time, we had 5 different military bases. And so kind of had a military mindset. So I did have aspirations thinking it would be a career, and I went all in. I applied for and received an appointment to West Point. But interestingly, in parallel as a young boy, I had my sights set on the Corps of Cadets at Texas A&M. And when the West Point process came around and I got the acceptance letter and it said report on this date, that was bad news for me. And my mom said, what's wrong? And I said, this letter means I'm not going to go to A&M. And she said, then don't go to West Point. Real simple, that common sense. Just, if that's your sense of where you need to go and what you need to do. So I respectfully declined the appointment and got my Army scholarship teed up to go to Texas A&M and join the Corps of Cadets. And the point of saying all that, one of the big principles of leadership I learned being a young cadet as a freshman, we had a very central theme, and that was you cannot be a leader until you learn how to be a follower.
Yeah.
And we spent our whole freshman year subjected to all manner of challenge that was proving whether or not we were able and willing to be followers, and even quite honestly at times followers of bad leaders, but nonetheless followers. Yeah. And you learn from the good, you learn from the bad, and you develop your own mindset. And the other really key element and value that was instilled in us was the it's the synergy idea. The sum of the parts is greater than the math tells you it's going to be. And we were encouraged to operate as a group, not as an individual. We didn't have an order of merit list in our cadet processing at Texas A&M, there was a class ranking, but it was not the classic order of merit that are used in the military academies. And we, on the other hand, were rated on our ability to be good team members. And of course, that carried over into what I did learn and experience in the military, that, you know, you wanted that guy in the foxhole with you you wanted to know he's got your back. And that's not an individualistic idea, that's a team idea.
Yeah, exactly. When I served with many Texas A&M grads, and so for the Aggies watching this, they're saying, "Oh, Doug, you picked Texas A&M over West Point. What other choice could there possibly be? You made the obviously right choice, you know." So I'm a big fan of both. I'm a fan of the service academies, but you know, I don't know if I've ever served with anybody other than outstanding who came from Texas A&M. I'm sure there's a bell curve. I'm just telling you, the guys I ran into, I just happened to hit it lucky. And there were more than a few, and they were all very proud of being Aggies. And I thought many of them coming in as second lieutenants, it was clear that they had been fundamentally grounded in the aspects of leadership, team building, being a team member and all of that. And it was refreshing to watch. I was an older guy. I was a prior enlisted guy, so I had a little bit more experience, but those guys were well ahead of the curve when it came to brand new second lieutenants, you know.
Well, if I may tell you a quick story about my early Army experience relative to what you just said. You're right. I do believe, and I have always looked back with fond memories of what we were trained to think about and be about. And I got to exercise it on one of my first duty stations. I was, after I got through officer basic and all that, I was transferred to be an executive officer of a large training unit. And as part of that duty, the mess hall was mine. And right after I signed in and took station, my mess sergeant was reassigned, and I had a new guy coming in. And this fellow showed up, and I already had his file, and I was excited to meet him because in his file, he had all the blue ribbon awards. He had won everything the Army offered in food service competition and class of service and high remarks, glowing reviews. And he was a 20-year guy at the time. And but he comes into my desk and reports in, and he's got this scowl on his face. He was wishing me dead. And I didn't react. I invited him to sit down so we could chat a little bit, and we talked, but he was basically just yes or no, sir, nothing else. And finally I said, "Sergeant, you strike me as having a concern. What's on your mind? You know, talk to me." And he glared his eyes and he looked at me and he said, "I don't like officers in my mess hall." And I said, "Okay." I said, "I tell you what," I said, "here's the deal. Here's what we're going to do." I said, "You would not have received all these awards if you didn't follow the process and procedures. And standard operating procedure requires you to get an officer's signature on all your requisitions." I said, "You're not going to have a slice of bread in that mess hall if I don't sign the requisition." And he goes, "Yes, sir." And I said, "So here's the deal. You do your paperwork. You call me when it's ready. And I will come over there. I will be in your mess hall, but my pledge is I'm going to review the paperwork, I'm going to give you my signature, and I'll turn around and walk out." I said, "But you got to build me a mess hall that is like another one of these. It's in your folder here." He said, he stood up, he was beaming, and he stuck his hand out to shake hands, and he goes, "We got a deal." And so, sure enough, the next day the phone rang. He said, "Lieutenant, I got my paperwork." So I went over there, and he had it all laid out nicely, very orderly, and I reviewed it, and it all looked good. I signed it, and I got up and walked out. Nothing else said. Day after that, another phone call, another pile of paperwork, same routine. Sign it, walk out. Third day I go over there, there's all the paperwork, but now there's these pastries and these flavored coffees. It smelled delicious. I mean, it was just amazing. But I reviewed the paperwork, I signed it, and I started to get up and walk out. And he goes, "Lieutenant, where are you going?" I said, "Sergeant, you don't like officers in your mess hall." And he said, "Oh, you know what?" He said, "Why don't you sit down and try some of this stuff? I'm thinking about putting this out for everybody." And from that point forward, we were a team.
Wow. Yeah, well, first of all, great story. Thanks for sharing it. And you knew the science of leadership. You knew what you had to do. You had to go check on that chow hall. You had to. But you artfully employed human nature, the study of human nature. And it didn't take much for that guy to realize, okay, I may not like officers, but I think I got a good one right here. So maybe I had to back off and give this guy a chance at least. It sounds like that's what happened. And so good on you. And that is a lot of, that's, the reaction on, I think, many brand new officers would have not been your reaction. I think, well, and they would do the classic second lieutenant, like, "Sergeant, I'm senior to you, even though you're my dad's age," and it goes downhill from there, So good on you for your response, and good on him for his response after a few days,
Yeah. It was that very short test period to break in and see if I was going to be a man of my word, and giving him the trust and belief that he would be a man of his word too. And after that, we had a great relationship, and I spent a lot of time over there after that happened.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure. Well, I always start off with one of the timeless questions here. Are leaders born or made? What do you think?
That's always an interesting question that I love to get asked and talk about. I had an opportunity several years after I had graduated from college, gone in service, and come back and gone into a banking career. And I'd been at the bank 5 or 6 years, and I got a call from A&M, my alma mater, the business college where I'd gone. The dean of the business college was looking for mentors to support a program that he had developed. And the intent of the program was to test that very question: are leaders born or bred? And part of the premise this thesis, this PhD was working on, what he wanted to do, he wanted to observe business students their first 2 years in college and see how they did. Did they naturally rise up to take on roles of student leadership or become influencers in their peer groups? And when he identified those people, then he invited them to join a fellows program that for their junior, senior, and maybe even graduate years, they were going to get extra coaching, extra mentoring, and a whole lot of other dynamics. And he set this up and got it going and ran it for a number of years. And it was real interesting, but without going too far around the barn, what I will tell you is I think the truth is in the middle somewhere. I think it's undeniable that I have encountered individuals in my life who have some seemingly natural, innate leadership ability. They're just undeniable. You want to pay attention, you want to follow, you want to respect them. And then there are others that probably did not start out that way, but they figured it out, and they practiced, they sought mentorship and coaching, and they truly did develop a skill set and a toolkit for being really good, impactful leaders. So I think it's a both and. If I had to statistically reflect on the population of people I've had a chance to work with, which is in the hundreds, by the way, but I would say it's probably less than 10% of those that show up with that innate ability that might have actually been born as a leader. and the rest are they have been thrust into management programs at their businesses, and they've had to figure it out along the way.
I absolutely agree with that. Your experiences and data set, so to speak, replicates mine entirely. You know, I do think as little as early as elementary school, some people are emerging already as leaders of their class or sports teams and all of that. But I also think, and I think you'll agree, that leadership is a learned skill. And, we got a lot of natural athletes. We got a lot of people out there born with the talent to be in the NBA or the NFL. And for various reasons, they don't get there,
That's right.
So, and my son's high school wrestling coach had a saying, I don't know if it was his quote or he stole it from somebody else, but he would talk to these kids and say, some of you are natural, some of you work hard. And he said, here's what I've learned, that hard work beats talent when talent won't work hard. And I thought that was great. And I think it applies to the leadership realm. There's a lot of natural leaders who really haven't put in the reps and they never really developed. There's other people, I've met people that said, Mike, when I got started, I resisted. I did not want to be a leader. I didn't think I had any aptitude for it. I didn't look the part. And here they are now talking to me as senior executives, So any last thoughts on this before we move on?
No, I agree with you. I think that's been my experience as well. And I like the sports analogy. A lot of people are born with what seems to be natural athletic ability, but until it's coached and honed, they're not going to have what it's going to take to perform at the higher levels.
Yes, exactly. Well, your career is very rich, and you've worked with, observed, coached countless leaders. So I want to ask you a two-sided question. The first side of it is, of the top tier of the very best leaders you've ever seen, Doug, are there any traits, habits, or skills that most of the very best leaders that you've been exposed to seem to share in common?
Yeah, there actually a couple make that list, and I don't know that I've tried to ever think in rank order of which one's more pertinent than others. But there are two or three that emerge for me. Number one is the ability to deliver clarity to their people. Nothing is more challenging than the leader who might be a brilliant expert, subject matter and otherwise, in what they're doing or wanting to do. But if they can't clearly communicate the vision and the expectation, you're not going to get the same result. And the way I tend to describe the symptom of the absence of clarity is that when I talk to a leader who comes to me and says, I'm frustrated, my team just seems to be treading water. They don't seem to be going anywhere. And I attribute that immediately to the lack of clarity. And the reason I believe that, and again, this is largely an accumulated reflection on all my years, is that if you've done a reasonably good job of hiring your team, and I know that's a big if, but if that's true, those people want to do good work. And in the absence of clarity, they are going to tend to do nothing rather than something, because they don't want to be wrong, they don't want to create problems, but they don't know what they need to be doing because of that lack of clarity, so they are going to be treading water. And when the leader can unveil a very clear vision and direction to give to a good team, you're going to accomplish great things.
Yes, I agree. Let's talk about the other side of that question. There is a bell curve, and so let's talk about ineffective or even toxic leaders. Any traits, habits, or lack of skills that are common to most of the least effective that you've seen?
Yeah, the least effective leaders, and this goes into the two or three other things I have in mind. Both have the good side of the coin and the bad side of the coin. Obviously, in the clarity issue, the bad side of the coin is the leader that just can't explain anything to anybody about where they're going. That's bad. But also the other thing is a very minimal, if not totally lacking, self-awareness of how they might be impacting people, and having no sense of no filter, no sense of propriety. Just say what's on your mind regardless, and let it out there, or whatever you want to call it. Kind of that creates the proverbial bull in the china closet sort of thing, and that's just a horrible environment to have to work for.
Yeah, I agree with that. You're well aware that there's I think if you Google this classic debate, if you Google what is the difference between leadership and management, or is leadership and management the same? I think there's hundreds of Google pages of results and no conclusive answer. And of course, there's no single authority that's going to decide black or white on this. So I'm asking you your thoughts. Leadership and management. Some people say they're interchangeable terms. You can call somebody a leader or a manager. It's the same thing. What are your thoughts? Is leadership, obviously they're related, I think, but are they in fact the same things, or is there a difference? And if so, what's the difference between leadership and management?
In my humble opinion, they are different and can be talked about and can be pursued differently. And to sum it up quickly, the key distinction that I land on and use a lot: management is about process, but leadership is about people. And I usually quickly say there can be individuals that are promoted into management roles that become really, really good managers. They hit the deadlines, they hit the KPIs, performance numbers are wonderful. I mean, they're getting the process executed to a gold standard. However, if they've not done anything to contemplate the people side of the business, I mean, really lean into the people development side of it, there is going to likely be a history of, while the operating numbers look good, when you go to the HR part of the equation, you're going to see high turnover, low morale, often low engagement scores. A lot of those, when people do their Glint surveys, a lot of low-ranking numbers in those kind of operating units where the person of authority is nothing but a manager. So I think that's a distinction, but the individual that can take that role, learn how to be a good manager, and invest in becoming a true leader of the people, then all of your numbers are going to begin to look better. You'll have a new, you and I know in the military we talk a lot about esprit de corps. We don't always hear that in the civilian world, but it's that high morale, that one for all and all for one kind of mindset, and it takes leadership to build that. You can't orchestrate that through process.
Yes, I agree entirely with that. In fact, I wrote a book that serves as a textbook for my coaching and consulting engagements. And one of the chapters is on leadership and management. And I use a screenshot and put it on LinkedIn, just one page. And Doug, I'm telling you, I post daily for years on LinkedIn. I have a fairly decently large following. When I put that screenshot up, exponentially more shares, likes, and comments. So it strikes a chord. And there's a quote in there that I made up. It said, here's my thoughts on leadership and management. We lead people and manage things. Mm-hmm. And those things can be resources, assets, projects, machines, whatever. And where people go wrong is when they want to manage people as if they're inanimate objects, incapable of thinking, like that machine or a Venn diagram. And I say that to be a really good leader, you have to also be a competent manager. But I share your view. I think they are welded at the hip, so to speak, but they are different skills. And I want to ask you this, I think at some point, after years, maybe a couple of decades, people who become good leaders, they're very comfortable in their skin as leaders. And not that they can't learn more, but at some point they consider, I'm nearing the height of my game. I'm good. I'm a good leader. The management skills, however, in some cases are perishable, and or there are new things that you've got to learn big time. I say leadership is about human nature. Human nature hasn't changed, never will. Management, however, who among us needed to know social media 20 years ago as a leader? Remote workforce, Twitter, software as a service. In other words, these things are constantly evolving, much like a doctor graduating med school 30 years ago. If he doesn't keep current, he's a dated doctor within 5 years probably. Any thoughts on the need for leaders to not only be effective leaders, effective managers? I guess what I'm alluding to is when you sign up to be a leader, to be good at it, and remain current, you have to sign up to be a lifelong student of the science and art of leadership and the science and art of management. And I think what we're agreeing on is there's some difference there, and the management is always evolving.
Right.
Always.
Right. No, you raised some good points and great examples, and that's absolutely true. And as we all know, the big thing on the horizon right now is the ability to involve AI in whatever you might be doing, whatever kind of business you might have, and that's just yet again another challenge in the continuing evolution of the landscape out there. I totally agree with what you said. I think at the root, if I can play back what I heard you talking about, it's that willingness to sign up as a lifelong learner. When you say you want to be, even if you want to just pursue a management track, using our examples, you still need to be that lifelong learner for all the reasons you're talking about. But same is true in leadership. And I do a lot of work with people when I meet a new client. Inevitably, this again is an interesting phenomenon. I will ask people, have you ever thought about the leader you want to be? And they'll go, oh, yeah, I've thought about it. Or sometimes they say, no, not really. And I'll say, well, let's start writing it out. If you wrote out a profile description, and you can just use keywords. You don't have to write a paragraph or a book, just keyword elements. What kind of leader do you really want to be? And it's amazing how many people have never done that work, even though they've been in a position of leadership for quite some time. And I've actually talked to CEOs that haven't done that work yet. They have this idea, they know what works, quote unquote, but they haven't really claimed a persona of leadership that they want to represent. And for some, depending on the situation, I may say, let's put it this way. You're kind of in the sunset years of your career. Your runway may be 5 years, maybe 8 years. I don't know. You still got some time, meaningful time left. What do you want your legacy to look like? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever really define that and frame that and set the goal for it? And I've had grown men break down in tears when I ask them that question.
Yeah, I agree with that. I am personally big on legacy. And I think I mentioned maybe in the green room that, my passion is to help leaders during and after my life. And so how are you going to help after your life, Mike? You're going to be dead. Well, I'm going to leave videos, books, snippets, anecdotes. And I love to write leadership content. And I tell people, and I'm a morning person, I tell people I write to my grandchildren's grandchildren every morning. And they're like, how many grandchildren do you have? Well, years ago, I'd say none. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? I said, I am vain enough to think that this leadership stuff that I'm leaving, some of it is going to be relevant 50 to 100 years from now. And whatever the internet looks like, I hope somebody finds a video and says, all right, that's no longer, but that one, that's still valid, you know? And so I'm very big on legacy, and my experience mirrors yours. I haven't had anybody cry, but I don't know if I've ever had an executive answer about his legacy. They get wrapped up into, well, I want to be successful. Obviously I am. And I guess maybe I took the company from 400 million to 1.8 billion. The stock price went up. What kind of leadership DNA are you leaving? Like, what are you leaving on the human side of it? And I think just about everyone, if not everyone, gives me the blank stare. They've never, ever considered that, you know?
Right.
And I'm a big fan of the Stoics and the ancients and all that. Can't remember who said it, but it's on my wall here, and it said, "What we leave behind is not what is engraved in on stone monuments, but what is woven in the lives of others." I never forgot that. So we're hitting on the same cylinders here. You know, any thoughts?
Well, it's funny you say that quote, and I'm not familiar with it. I probably need to go look it up. But what I tell my guys when we start talking about the legacy question, I'll tell them quickly, I'll say, your company's not going to put your name on the building. That's not what we're talking about. I said, we are talking about your fingerprints on people's hearts and minds that are going to still be in the game when you're gone. And, you know, that's usually the part that kind of, if they are prone, that's what brings on the waterworks. But and it is interesting. And I have had people. I won't go into all the detail, but I was working with a pretty senior executive at one company, and about 3 months after we got going, I got a call from their HR chief. They said, "What have you done with?" I'll call him Mike. "What have you done with Mike?" I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, all of his direct reports are calling me, and they want to know what happened to him. I said, what are you talking about? Tell me what you're talking about. And they said, he has done a 180. He was a tyrant as a leader, and in the last 3 months, he is now a mentor. He's a friend. He is developing people, and they're feeling it, and they're loving it. And so we had a little bit of a talk about that. And part of the backstory on that, I had gone to his office early in our engagement, and he was just getting off a phone call, and I could tell it was intense. And there had been an incident at one of his facilities, and the plant manager had to call him. And the legacy in this business, when you made that call and there was an incident, you got a pound of flesh taken out of your backside. That was just culturally what they did. And he had done that. Apparently, I had missed that part, but I could tell that's what had happened. And I asked him after he got off the call, I said, what did you really say to that guy? And it took him a while to admit word for word what he had really said. And I said, do you remember being that guy when you came up the chain? And he said, yeah. And I said, and when your boss said that to you, what did that mean? What did that make you feel? And he said, well, it was worthless information, but I knew it was necessary. That's just the way we operate, and I had to, give my pound of flesh. I said, why? What would be wrong with changing that? Yeah. Everybody knows there was an incident. Okay, so let's think about a little more productive learning from it, and apparently that's what he had done. He had immediately made a big shift in those particular calls, and that's what caught everybody off guard because everybody had been trained. That was the culture.
Yeah, I love that story, and I have had that experience too. And I want to get your thoughts on this. I'm talking to the young leaders out watching and listening to this. You don't have to be an executive coach to realize the impact. I think leaders at every level, once you have that first revelation, somebody shares with you how much you help them as a human being and as a leader or a follower or whatever, I call it the crack cocaine phenomenon. They say at crack cocaine, you take one hit, you're hooked for life. You can't get off it. When I felt that for the first time, that somebody thanked me for something I did, mentored them, and it made a difference, it was intoxicating to me. And I realized I'd done something good, and I wanted to feel that again. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the drug of choice for me. It kept me into leadership. I just crave that. I still love to hear how, and it could be something minor. Mike, I never took notes in a meeting before, and you told me I should, and I have, and I'm better now. It could be something minor, but just knowing that you're having an effect on others, I think is a noble undertaking, and quite honestly, it feels good. It's an ego boost too. Your thoughts?
Totally agree. I mean, I think we all in the human species, we want some sense of recognition and awareness for having provided value to the world. Otherwise, you're perpetually asking the question, why am I here? What am I doing? And where am I going? And those are very unsettling questions if you don't have some form of answer for them. And without getting too deep into mental health and all that, which obviously many people suffer from in various degrees, but for those that are trying to do the leadership work, you're right. I mean, it is rewarding to feel that. And I think there's a delicate tipping point in there somewhere between, yes, it's an ego boost. Yes, it's a sense of satisfaction, but to what real degree, and I think we go back to our opening mention of servant leadership. I think those who are genuinely aspiring to be servant leaders,
yep,
they recognize and appreciate the value in receiving that feedback, but they don't take it so far to, pump up, grow their head size a couple of, hat sizes and oh, look at me, look what I'm doing. They don't deal with it that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wanted to ask you another thing that people often, big bone of contention, and that is the topic of responsibility and accountability. Mm-hmm. Clearly, they are linked. I see a lot of different answers out there, and I know this is a favorite topic of yours. So let us hear your thoughts on, first, what's responsibility and accountability mean, and are they one and the same? Were they always irretrievably linked together, or you could have one and not the other? I'm just curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, when you posed that question to me in our run-up, I've thought about it, and to me, I think they too are joined at the hip, and I think the driving force is the question of ownership. Is somebody willing to take ownership of the task they've been given or the role they've been given? And in ownership, you bear the responsibility and you provide some accountability for others' expectations. And of course, just breaking that down, accountability by itself in the modern business world is far more a negative word than it is a positive word. In far too many places, accountability is attributed to disciplinary action.
Yeah.
And it's got a taint on it for that. And again, in my humble opinion, that's a very unfortunate scenario. And I certainly challenge leaders to think about ways that they can flip that accountability idea on its head and get away from the disciplinary aspects of it and get more into a positive, again, tied fundamentally to the concept of ownership. And so like it would be, the example would be, Mike, if you're working for me, I would say, Mike, do you want to own this job that you've got? And you'd go, what does that mean, Doug? And I'd say, well, you're probably familiar with talking to an employer about your expectations, and the owner's going to tell you his expectations. And that's the way business operates. Everybody comes to the table with a certain set of expectations, but what never gets talked about is obligation. You tell me you want a fair wage and you want to learn more about this business and this industry and you want to go to training and do all that. But what's your sense of obligation for being here? What are you going to provide? And a good answer would be for you to say, well, you know what, Doug, I'm gonna take your training. I'm going to show up on time. I'm going to meet my deadlines. I'm going to follow the procedures. Those are my obligations. And in trade-off for that, I hope you'll consider my expectation. Now, guess what? My side of that discussion, and by the way, I'm obligated to give both sides of it too as the employer, I would have to say, guess what? My expectation is you show up on time, you follow my procedures, you take my training, you pay attention to the assignments you're given and deliver on time. My obligation is I will reward you with fair and equitable reviews, considering pay advances and promotions and opportunities to grow into other roles and take some additional training down the road, and we will have those discussions on a regular basis. And so you get this four-blocker that's kind of a yin and yang of each other, talking about that sense of expectation and obligation, but it's the obligation part of the equation that never gets discussed.
Yeah.
And then when you want to have an accountability talk, really all you are talking about is sort of that sense of fail on the number. You missed the KPI. Come on, Mike, you missed the KPI for the second month in a row. Well, it would be far more meaningful to be able to say, let's go back to what we talked about in obligations, not expectations, but obligations. And this seems to be happening because maybe there's a knowledge gap. Maybe you've forgotten something in training, and let's go back to the basics here. Let's work on this. Let's figure out how to get you back up to the place where you can optimize your success.
Yes, I agree entirely, especially with the knowledge gap. I have been trained in the Marines. There's two reasons when somebody's falling short of their obligations and your expectation. It's either a will problem or a skill problem. And don't automatically jump to the will. That a guy's unmotivated. He just, he's not good. Bad Marine. It's your responsibility, if the skill gap exists, to discover it. And if it does exist, it's your responsibility. You should have done it better, or spotted that he wasn't taking the training well the first time, so make him repeat it and all of that. So we are joined at the hip on that. Another thing that I'd like to hear a thought on, a classic leadership dilemma that I think some leaders never get out, and that is, all of us who are in leadership roles, unless you just were anointed a leader before you were ever a follower, we were doers before, we woke up in the morning, we had things to do. We were doers. We weren't leading for the most part. Then you become a leader, and the classic trap is the guy that, puts on the stripes, so to speak, but is doing the same exact thing every day, or most of the same things he was doing as a doer. And of course, something's got to give. It doesn't work out well. So what are your thoughts on how leaders can ensure that they are actually focusing on the appropriate leadership topics, issues, and skill sets, and not, being the fire marshal and not the fireman anymore, that analogy. Yeah. Any thoughts?
Absolutely. And I actually talk about this a lot, both on my podcast and in articles I write, and even work with my individual clients. there is a phenomenon, and I'm going to add to your buildup there. There is a phenomenon in modern business. We hire people to be doers in our businesses for the most part. So young person comes out of school, they take a job, and they are an individual contributor. They've got a role, they've got a set of duties, and they perform well. So, they become the best person on the team. And at some point, they'll often get recognized for that, and the company will be saying, we need a team leader or we need a supervisor over this function. You're the best one on the team. Let's hire you. Let's make you the supervisor. And poof, somebody is now, at a minimum, they're on the management track. Are they on the leadership track yet? Going back to our other discussion, that's another question. But they're definitely in the management track. Okay, fine. So psychologically, what that individual is prone to do without any other coaching or influence, they're going to look in the mirror and they're going to say, I got recognized for my good work. If I'm still going to be successful, my only option is to double down. I got to figure out how to do more work. And you might be faced with the people problems on the team, and you're being told, go handle so-and-so on your team, go figure that out. But all the while, you're still thinking about, I have to produce, I'm still doing this. And businesses don't always do a good job of changing that expectation discussion with first-time leaders. They don't clearly say, you don't have to have a personal book of business. You don't have to have a personal KPI anymore because you're now supervising this larger team. So these people get caught on the treadmill of performance at the transactional level, and even if they get a second promotion, that's why it worked. I doubled down, I did more, and now I've got another promotion. Guess what? I got to do more, whatever that is. And then eventually people are starting to hear feedback that says, we need you to be more of a strategic thinker. We need you to stop being transactional and be more strategic. And people generally don't know what that means. They have no idea what that's supposed to mean. And at worst case, I guess, they feel like they're betraying the doer part that they use to get them to the success level they've gotten, all the while never being told that was okay to abandon the doing and do more leading. And it's after usually about that third or fourth promotion, the companies wake up and say, let's send this person to leadership training. And you go, why didn't I get that 2 jobs ago?
Don't even get me started on that topic, the dearth of corporate training and development. And, it's just shocking to me. In the Marine Corps, we wouldn't dare send a young American to combat without training. But we routinely take guys and put them in business combat. They've never shot a rifle before, so to speak. And we expect great results. And sometimes get them, but more often than not, let's just say there's some friction point happening, So anyway, I'm big on trust, as are you, as is servant leadership. I wrote a book called Trust-Based Leadership. It's important to all of us. Leaders are out there, they're all nodding their heads. Yes, I want to have a culture of trust in my team, however big or small it is. What are some tips or techniques you have for leaders, how they can create, enhance, and sustain a culture of trust and all of that implies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I, too, wrote a book about it. It's called Trust at Work. And I actually co-authored it with a good friend of mine who sadly is now deceased. But what my friend and I, and we go back, he actually worked for me at one point in our banking lives together. And that was like almost 50 years ago when we worked together. But we've stayed friends and, we've done a lot of things together. But we wrote this book. Actually, we started writing it before 2020. It was actually released in 2018, I believe. But it was right about the time that Google released their famous study on Project Aristotle, where they identified this thing called psychological safety as a big influencer of whether or not there is high trust in a team environment. And when you read the Project Aristotle study, and you can Google it and you'll get all the data and read it, it's pretty fascinating. But basically the story they're telling about their findings on psychological safety all boils down to the idea of trust. When an individual feels trusted at work and they feel like they can trust others, they are more prone to elevate their performance into a discretionary zone and contribute a lot more to the greater good of the team. So my colleague and I, what we were wrestling with is, okay, that's factual data, but how do you get there? If you're a leader, how do you really make that happen? And we started breaking down the phenomenon of trust, and it's really, in our mind, it's a pretty simple premise. And I like to use the dating analogy. When a man and a woman decide to make a connection and they want to go out for dinner for the first time, what typically happens? There's a series of questions. You know, what kind of food do you like? Where did you grow up? What kind of movies do you like? Music, style, fashion, sports teams, whatever. And it's this series of exchange where you're fundamentally asking questions. And while I don't like to go so far as to call it checking all the boxes, in effect, that's what we're doing. And my colleague and I argue that the same thing happens in the workplace. An employee shows up for work, and they're going to bring a series of questions. Now, they may never voice the question, but it's in their mind and in their heart. And what our book does, it breaks down, for a leader to be effective in doing this, it breaks down all of the questions into a 6-part study or a 6-part framework. And I have been successful in working with teams presenting this 6-part framework, and I'll talk about all of the elements. And then at the end of the workshop, typically I'll ask them, I'll do a stump the chump game. I'll say, okay, give me an example, give me a question you wrestle with, and let me show you where this fits in the model. And everything goes somewhere is what it amounts to. And I can hit those 6 areas real fast without getting into all the other details. But the very first question is people. Do I even like the people I'm working with now? I may intuitively like the company. I read the brochures. I've seen the commercials. I've watched the videos. That's good. But do I really like the people I'm working with? And can I develop a level of confidence and camaraderie working with them? The next is purpose. Why does this team exist? Can I get on board with the purpose that this team represents? Then you have to have a plan on how you're going to execute and fulfill the purpose. Then number 4, you get into practice of let's go do the work. That's boots on the ground. Let's look at how things are running. Does all this fulfill, do the tools and systems and process and resources I have access to, does that fulfill the purpose and the plan? Then 5th is performance, and that's the question of, am I going to get rated fairly for everything I do? Is there going to be a good way to acknowledge what is happening? And then last, and 6 is we call it profit, and profit is not just about the money, but it's that sense of reward, and back to kind of esprit de corps. I'm proud to be part of this team. I'm glad I've made the commitment. I'm glad I've invested the work. And when an individual comes to work and gets all their questions about those 6 things answered to their satisfaction, they will inherently have a higher level of trust for that situation. But as you can imagine, in the business setting, anything can go wrong in any of those 6 areas, either simultaneously, concurrently, or consecutively, and it'll erode the level of trust that can be allowed and committed. But to even have a hope for building trust, you have to be able to address those questions in a positive, proactive way. And that doesn't mean the leader always has to say yes. They just need to give the answer.
Yes, I agree with that. Our time is starting to run short here, but I want to ask you this. As an executive coach, I'd like to hear your experience. I find a lot of the younger folks, 20s, 30s, and 40s, when it comes to coaching, they're like, I'll do that later, later. And I'm like, boy, I tell you, the earlier you can get involved in having some role models, having some mentors, and there could be several of them on different topics, and getting some investing, even if your company won't pay for it, investing yourself in some form of professional coaching, that might be the differentiator for you ever getting to the senior leadership role. So I'm getting long-winded here, but what's your thoughts on advice to the younger folks of doing all that as early as possible and not waiting till your 50s and say, well, when they make me executive, then I'll get a coaching then? That, generally speaking, is the prevailing attitude, I find.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it does go back. Sports analogies apply here. All good athletes have coaches. And one great example that hit the news a couple of years ago, Phil Mickelson, the great pro golfer, who is farther along in his career, he was talking about he hired a coach to help him figure out how to gain 1/4 of a stroke per round. And when I heard that, I thought, 1/4, you don't score that way. How do you know you're getting that 1/4? And the point was, you do enough fine tuning that if you add it up, 1/4 for 4 rounds is 1 full stroke, and that's often the differentiator in who wins the tournament or not, just 1 stroke. So it's that kind of dialed in focus. The point being, all great athletes have coaches to continue to hone and refine their skills. And whether it's a strength and conditioning coach or a mobility coach or even a mindset coach, they all invest and pursue that development. And it's not always provided directly by the team they're on. It's an investment they make off season when nobody's watching, trying to get that edge to boost their competition level. And same is true in business. And at a minimum, to your point, I would encourage young people to find mentors, to not be afraid to walk up to that person that you've learned to respect. And you might just be thinking about one particular skill or one particular attribute that person demonstrates. Ask them about that. I like the way you work a room. Can you talk to me about that? Can you tell me how you learned that? Can you, help me develop that skill? And don't be afraid to ask. All good leaders are very willing to give back. They just have to be asked.
I agree with that. In fact, there's a snippet of Steve Jobs on the YouTube channels. And if you Google Steve Jobs, just ask, that's the title of that snippet. He said when he was growing up, he was 15 years old and he found, remember Hewlett-Packard, the big company. Well, this was long ago. You remember the old phone books with people's names and that. He found, I think his name was Bill Hewlett or Bob Packard, whatever the front. He found one of them and called him and said, my name's Steve Jobs. I'm 15 years old. I'm interested in this. Do you have any spare flux capacitors, some part? And this is a major company at this point. And the guy said, sure. And he sent him one. Sent this kid a project, I think for his project, and hired him as an intern. Mm-hmm. And he said, that emboldened me to always, don't be shy about asking people. He said, I find most well-accomplished people are more than happy to talk to others. You may have to get on their schedule a little bit because they're busy. And he said, even now, some would think Steve Jobs, even now, if someone reaches out to me, I will always say yes, unless it's just wildly inappropriate. I would always say yes, but let's work on the date and time of it and all of that. So I agree with you. And I've done that. I ask people, for help along the way, and I never had one of them refuse me to do it.
Right.
As long as I was willing to do it at their convenient time and all of that. So
neither have I. And you're right. The timing question can be an issue because of busyness and pre-commitment, but good leaders will always find and make the time, and they will be more than happy to contribute to that kind of development of a young person.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to get your thoughts on this. For those listening out there, the best advice I can give you, the best analogy that I can use is ask for advice and mentorship at the appropriate level. In other words, if you're interested in plumbing, if you're a builder and you're interested in learning more about plumbing, don't contact a world famous architect.
Yeah.
Contact an industrial plumber. He's probably going to help you out. The architect probably knows, but he doesn't know it as well either as that guy that's been doing it every day. And so That's my crude analogy. Any final thoughts on that?
No, I agree, and I think and also the ask needs to be a little bit specific. I don't think it would be productive to just walk up to a senior person in your community or your work and say, "Can you be my mentor?" And the person will go, "About what?" And you go, "Oh, everything." It's like, no, I don't have time for that, and I'm not even sure where we would start. But do you have something specific you can give me? So like I said, it's kind of that, for me, it ties back to that idea. If you can define the leader you want to be, there should be a list of attributes and skills, some of which you're already doing reasonably well. Others are more aspirational. You want to grow into them. So that's where you get your mentor help. If it's building relationships or working a room, or I've heard people talk about just the ability to remember names, just something very direct that others have demonstrated an ability to be very good at. That's the thing you ask them to help you with.
I agree with that. And we're fully aligned. And I tell guys, and gals, relative to this topic, pick the appropriate person at the appropriate level and make it real easy for them to say yes to you. In other words, don't go to them and say, well, everything. That's a full-time job. I don't have time for that. If you ask him about one issue or one problem, he's going to probably say yes. He'll take care of you. And likely, when you respond well, he's going to say, hey, I'm glad I helped. Reach out anytime if there's anything else I can help you for.
Right. Right.
So, last real question on this I'd like to ask you is, for leaders at every level, do you have any suggestion if they would say, if they would say, Doug, 3 tips that you would give all leaders that they can do today to enhance, tweak, or calibrate their leadership effectiveness? Can you think of any right off the top of your head?
Yes, part of my answer is going to be a repeat. One is the clarity issue. Don't forget that. Number 2 is be intentional. In a crazy busy world, it's too easy to get swept up in the momentum of the day. And I know I hear this a lot. People say, "Oh, I had my calendar all planned out, and the first phone call blew it up." Okay, great, but what are you going to do about getting it back on track and not just being reactive to things? And that actually leads me to my third point. I think leaders need to learn more about being able to respond in moments rather than react. And I use the analogy, if you go to the doctor and you're sick and they prescribe you some medicine, if you react to the medicine, you got new problems. But if you respond to it, you're on your way to restored health. I think the same is true in leadership. The more you can learn how to respond to the things going on around you rather than reacting, you're likely going to have a more intentional environment with clarity, and people are able to rally around that and work toward it. If you're too reactionary, everybody's living on the edge, everybody's walking on eggshells. You hear all those phrases that come with that. And but part of the ability to be responsive rather than reactive is to get back to that basic I started with. Know and understand the leader you really want to be.
Yes,
Because if you know that, the situation that bubbles up, you can make a quick decision. Is this consistent with where I want to go, or is this somehow contrary? Let me respond accordingly.
Thank you for that. And Bob, and I keep calling you Bob, I'm sorry. I had Bob earlier in the day, so I apologize, Doug. Doug, I always ask everybody at the end of the podcast, if you could bring back one leader from the past, spend a day with that person, who would you choose and why?
You know, I would have answered that Abraham Lincoln. I've been a longtime student of Abe Lincoln's, but I've just recently started watching a documentary on Theodore Roosevelt that I find fascinating. And I actually went to a Roosevelt high school, so I knew a little bit about his life. But even at our school, we hit the high points. We were the Rough Riders, and we had a big stick mascot thing that we did, but didn't really know a lot of the story, and I'm finding this documentary really fascinating, and I think he would be the one I'd really like a chance to pick his brain.
Great choice. I'm not sure anybody's picked that before, but I will tell you, I'm loving life. I perked up because he is one of my boyhood idols. And then I got into the military and all that. So I've read about him extensively. And he was a Renaissance man. A lot of people don't know, he was a Rough Rider and tough guy and all that. And really, brusque president, force of nature. Smart guy. He's written many books on botany and leadership. And there's a big museum in New York City called the Museum of Natural History. And up until about a couple of decades ago, the vast majority of big game animals in there that were taxidermied and were shot by Teddy Roosevelt on expeditions to Africa. And he did that. He was wealthy, from a wealthy family, so he went to Africa and shot lions and, musk oxes and elephants and all of that so they could go in there. Fascinating guy. And I was a college wrestler. He's the only U.S. president that ever actively engaged in boxing, wrestling, and judo matches in the White House. Yeah. And with boxing, he was a boxer on, I think he went to Yale. He was a boxer on their team and did well. He was sparring with, I think, the current heavyweight champion in the White House. And of course, the heavyweight champion, Teddy Roosevelt, was not a large man. And he's taking it easy, and Teddy got incensed. He goes, no, old chap, let's go, So the bottom line is the heavyweight champ hit him in the eye, blinded him in the eye for life. He never regained it. And his major concern was, well, now I have to learn how to shoot with my other eye. That was his major concern. Not that he lost an eye, that it was going to affect his marksmanship. Yeah. So I love the guy. I could speak about him forever. So good choice. If you can arrange that meeting, Doug, please let me go. I'll buy lunch. I'll pay for it.
That sounds great. Sounds great, Mike.
Well, listen, it's been a really compelling podcast. This is going to be a very popular episode. I think people are going to want to reach out to you. Where can they find your books, and how do they contact you, Doug?
Best way to contact me is through my direct website, and it is dougthorpe.com. That's THORPE on the end.com. I am on LinkedIn. All my books are on Amazon. They're easily obtainable. Just put my name in the search bar and you'll get, there are 5 of them now. And my podcast, Leadership Powered by Common Sense, is available on all streaming services and on YouTube as well.
Oh, excellent. Well, I'm sure you're going to get contacted. And this has, again, been very enlightening. I can't thank you enough, Doug, for coming.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you've been there, done that, and your credibility is unquestioned. So I wish you continued health and success and keep impacting those leaders, because you are definitely to the quote earlier, you are definitely weaving much into the lives of others, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and recommend to your friends. Please visit our website at fidelisleadership.com and sign up for our leadership newsletter. Until next time, remember the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Pericles.
What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but is woven in the lives of others.